So I really want to thank Professor Alstad for coming onto this podcast. He is a true expert in his field and a scientist. He is a distinguished professor and the inaugural Protective Life Endowed Chair in Healthy Aging Research in the Department of Biology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where he was department chair from 2014 to 2022. He has published more than 200 scientific papers and won multiple awards. He's written four books: Why We Age, which has been translated into 9 languages; Real People Don't Own Monkeys, co-authored with his wife; To Err is Human, To Admit It Is Not, and other essays. And the book that we're going to discuss today, Methuselah's Zoo: What Nature Can Teach Us About Living Longer, Healthier Lives. So, Professor Alsted, thank you again for coming. Perhaps you could introduce yourself and the work that you have done.
I have a rather unusual academic history. It really started, my undergraduate degree is in English literature, and I never took much in the way of science classes as an undergraduate. I did do math because I was a math major initially. And when I got out of college, I really spent some time trying to write a novel. But to put food on the table, I took a series of jobs while I was doing that, the last of which was a job training big cats for the film industry. I stumbled into that job. I had no previous experience, but that experience awakened my interest in basically what makes animals tick. And when I decided I didn't want to spend the rest of my life working in Hollywood, I decided that I would go to graduate school, study animals in the wild. And my PhD was all about animal behavior. How much do they fight? How long do they fight? How much risk will they take? Under what conditions? And then as a postdoc, I was studying the social behavior of these birds in South America that have quite an interesting social system. And by chance, a friend of mine, this was at a biological field station. A friend of mine was there to study some foxes, and he was having no luck at all. And that's because he'd set his traps out to try to trap foxes so he could put radio collars on them, and his traps kept filling up with opossums. And he said, "Well, what could you possibly do with that?" So we put our heads together and came up with an idea, wrote a grant proposal, and it got funded. And so by this time, he had moved back to the States. So I was the one that was there on the ground actually doing this work with the opossums. The nature of the project, it had nothing to do with aging, but what I had to do is I had to recapture each of the opossums every month.
Right.
And when I did that, I suddenly realized that they were aging at this phenomenal rate. I would catch them, they would be, prime age, vigorous adults. And 3 months later, they would have cataracts and have lost muscle and be parasitized and just look ancient. And that observation just fascinated me because I had assumed that they would age about like a house cat because they're
Right.
about the same size as a house cat.
Right.
But here they were aging more like a mouse or even faster than a mouse. And
Mhm.
so I got
Right.
really interested. And by the time the original project I was working on was published, and it was published in Nature, so it was a high profile paper, I completely lost interest in that project and I was off on aging research. And so now I've been studying the biology of aging for, 35 plus years. So I think that background gave me, first of all, a broad appreciation of how variable animals are in their rate of aging, but also an appreciation for the things that are important in their natural environment that they lose when we bring them into the lab. I think what we can learn from the laboratory studies is sort of the critical places to look for advances in aging. But in terms of coming up with ways to make it better, then I think we should take advantage of nature because nature has had billions of years and billions of species on which to experiment with ways to combat aging. So my thought is that what we really need to do is focus on animals that do things better, that we know do things better that are critical to aging. So for instance, one of the patterns in aging is it's associated with the level of DNA damage, of unrepaired DNA damage. Well, there are already animals we know that are much better at repairing DNA damage than we are. So can we potentially learn something from them? We know there are animals that are much more cancer resistant than we are. Can we learn from them? There's very few study going on of those animals that are successful at aging, and I'd like to see that change, and I think it's beginning to, but we still have a long way to go.
Good. Which animals would you say are most successful at aging?
Well, I mean, there are small animals like hydra, these freshwater creatures that are, less than a centimeter long typically, but that and just are a stalk with a bunch of tentacles. As far as we can tell, at least in the laboratory, they don't age at all. And that's very rare. The hydra are very unusual animals, and to the extent that all of their cells are recent descendants of their stem cells.
Mm.
So they're very different than us. And the group that I think is being ignored are the birds.
Right.
The birds have just a variety of interesting features. So first of all, people don't realize how long they are. They look every day. Almost everyone will see birds, but birds live in the wild about 3 times as long as animals we're more familiar with live in captivity if they're
Mm.
the same body size. So to me, that's a clear target for trying to understand it. Now, it's not only their long lives, but they have these long lives despite the fact that they have traits that if we didn't know anything else, we would say what's going to make them short lived. For one thing, birds have a higher body temperature than we do, which means their chemical reactions are occurring faster. So, an average bird temperature in degrees Fahrenheit is around 104, 105 degrees. So about 40 degrees Celsius. That would be a bad fever
Yeah.
in a mammal. They also have levels of blood sugar that are as high as diabetics. So they
Mm.
basically are type 2 diabetics flying around. And those two things together, the high body temperature, high glucose, suggests that they should be aging quickly, but they don't. And so it's kind of mysterious to me that one of the most common animals in the world that has so much potential to teach us about aging goes virtually unstudied.
Right. So you had mentioned there were some things that stood out to me in your book. One was the fact that bats, they pretty much only feed on blood. So we've got a high protein meal. And then you had said that they can't live without blood for more than 72 hours, but if they don't get enough blood, they can share blood. So they have some sort of socialized connections. And then the other thing I noticed with bats is that they don't lose muscle mass as quickly as humans. That stood out to me because, there's a lot of research now on the negative effects of sarcopenia. The muscles have been called them the organ of longevity. So those two things stood out. So do you think in humans there is a benefit from high protein, calorie restricted diets? And what do you think protects them against sarcopenia?
Yeah, so a couple of things about the blood diet. So that's just a few species of bats, vampire bats that live on that. And they live pretty long. So vampire bats, which are one of the few bat species that are well studied, and that's because they're a vector for transmitting rabies, which is a real problem in more tropical areas. They can live up to 30 years, and they're roughly the size of a mouse. So how do they do that? And they do have that interesting social system. But I don't. They're so specialized in blood. There's so many features that are specialized. I don't think that eating pure protein and nothing else is a likely recipe for a long life. In terms of the loss of muscle mass, now this is really interesting to me because we lose muscle mass. We lose muscle rapidly when we're inactive. So if we're bedridden for some reason, if we've had a major surgery or something where they used to not get people up right away, they used to be in bed for weeks, and when they would finally try to get up, they could barely stand because they lost so much muscles. But bats, some species of bats, hibernate for 9 months out of the year. So they're relatively inactive for 9 months, and then they wake up and they fly away. So, how they do that, the other thing that's remarkable about them is that they preserve their hearing so well.
Yeah.
Bats, the insect-eating bats rely on hearing echoes of the screams they make in order to locate their prey. So if they lose their high frequency hearing, and those high frequencies are the ones that provide the most detailed look at exactly where animals are and which direction they're moving on. They lose that, they starve to death. Yet insect-eating bats can live 30 or 40 years, even though they're a third or a fourth the size of a mouse. And then they also have this incredible sense of spatial memory. So they
Mm.
fly, 50 miles or so in a night, catching insects, and then they make their way in the dark back to where they came from. If it's a cave that might have a million other bats in it, they may have left a pup somewhere
Mm.
in there, and they have to find their way back to that pup. So, considering that spatial memory is one of the things that's most vulnerable to age and neurodegenerative diseases, again, I think we have something to learn from looking in more detail at the way bat brains are constructed.
Right. So the other thing that stood out is temperature control, and there's a lot of interest now in hormesis, cryotherapy, saunas. Do you see any link between saunas and cryotherapy and ice buckets? Is there any correlation with animals that regulate their temperature differently? They hibernate.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a lesson to be learned from these temperature manipulations. I mean, hormesis, you mentioned it, the idea that a modest amount of stress, awakens a number of protective mechanisms inside of our cells. I think that's pretty well established and is something to pay a lot of attention to. But the animals that routinely spend a lot of time either particularly cold or particularly warm are adapted to that. They have all kinds of special enzymes and special adaptations to that. But I think the idea that providing ourselves with a modest amount of stress from time to time is likely beneficial. Some people think that the effect of exercise may be that it's a kind of stress. That doesn't explain its effect on muscles and all, but it might explain its effect on health, other aspects of health and longevity. In terms of cryo stress, again, it's another kind of stress. Whether that's a better kind of stress, I don't know. Certainly, there's a trend in nature for animals that live in cold environments to be particularly long-lived. One of my examples of this is a Greenland shark. The
Right.
Greenland shark is sort of famous because there's indication that they can live as long as 400 years, which is remarkable, way longer than any other vertebrate they know. But the thing about them is they live at a very, very slow pace. Greenland sharks, according to the same estimates that suggest they live 400 years, suggest that they don't become adults. They don't become capable of reproducing until they're 150 years old. That strikes me. That's really astonishing to me because evolution, cares about reproduction. It doesn't care really about how much you live. So, what advantage could there be to waiting 150 years to reproduce? I have no idea. But to give you an idea of how slowly they live, the maximum swimming speed that's ever been recorded in a Greenland shark is about 0.75 meters per second, which is
Oh, wow.
slower than a normal 80-year-old
Yeah.
walks.
Right.
And so they move very slowly. So I mean, it's a mystery how they catch their prey because they've been found with caribou and seals and all kinds of things in their stomach. I think it must be stealth. I think they
Mhm.
must move so slowly that it's easy for them to creep up on animals that are asleep or dark. They live very deep in the ocean, so where they live, it's very dark all of the time. So my guess is they get by stealth. That I think is a secret to their long life. I don't think they have that much to teach us. But another animal that lives in the cold that I do think has a lot to teach us about health and long life is a bowhead whale.
Right.
It's the longest lived mammal that we know about. The again, these chemical estimates of its longevity are that it lives over 200 years. It's one of the few animals that I think we underestimate its longevity because of the way we do it. But they're also the only whale that doesn't migrate to warm water to reproduce in the summer. They
Mhm.
actually stay in the Arctic year round. But they're mammals, and mammals, when they get cold, don't slow down their metabolic rate like sharks do. They actually increase their metabolic rate to try to stay warm because mammals have to keep a high body temperature. That's what really defines us. So the evidence is that bowhead whales have metabolic rates that may be 3 times as high as other animals of the same size. Of course, there are no other animals of the same size, so this is
Mhm.
all theoretical.
Right.
They're much larger than any living animals that we know of that are cold-blooded. But that suggests to me that they somehow have adaptations to prevent, to slow down all the processes of aging that they should be having. So I do think that we can learn a lot from them as well. Now, we're never going to have a laboratory colony of bowhead whales. I'm
Right.
sorry to say, but we've made so many advances in cell biology that I'm not sure that it wouldn't be possible to make a bowhead whale in a dish, so to
Mhm.
speak. I kind of like that idea. Of course, there are ideas that are crazy, but sometimes you need to do the research to find out, is your idea really crazy or is your idea only innovative and creative?
Yeah. So the other thing with animals that occurs to me is, well, for humans, there's a lot of focus on adequate sleep, avoiding chronic stress, avoiding sugar, and we're the only animal that limits the amount of sleep that we need. So, and the other thing about exercise, those blue zone projects, it was more functional exercises, and of course, animals don't go to the gym. So, I think you're right. We can learn a lot. Are there any parallels in terms of lifestyle? Um, I think a lot of stress is from anxiety, and presumably animals don't really have that sort of sort of dialogue in their brain saying that things are bad and looking at the past and looking at the future. I guess if we could be more like animals, we might live longer just in terms of lifestyle.
Interesting point. So in the wild, animals like lions sleep 20 hours a day, and
Mm.
then they wake up and they go kill something, and then they go back to sleep. Um, I think what's important is getting the amount of physical activity that's right for your species.
Mhm.
And our species grew up for, hundreds of thousands of years being physically active. You had to be physically active to get your food. Um, and we've really lost that in modern times. I don't typically call it exercise because that puts some people off. They think, oh, you have to be doing this where you're dripping sweat all over and
Right.
pumping iron. But really, what our ancestors did was they were just physically active all the
Right.
time. And it's becoming worse and worse and worse because it's easier to live your life now by sitting at a desk and wandering
Mm.
into the kitchen periodically,
Right.
which is kind of
Mhm.
what we have with our laboratory animals, right? When I worked in New Guinea, I worked among people that, lived a lot like people did 50 or 100,000 years ago. That is, food was hard to come by. They had to spend almost all of their day in some sort of physical activity. And it makes a huge difference. This was also a very mountainous part of New Guinea that I worked in. And so I just remember the first time that I arrived there, um, in this village, we hired all these people to carry all of our stuff up to the top of this mountain, which is where we wanted to do our studies. And I had a small day pack with just a few items in it that I put on my back, and the village headman said, "No, no, 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 you're going to slow us down too much. Give me that pack."
Mm.
And I was a little bit insulted because I always thought of myself as being very fit and all. So I handed him the pack, and then he turned around and handed it to his probably 12-year-old daughter. And
Mm.
she put it on her head and set off up the mountain. And have to tell you, within the next hour, I was so glad that she had that, not me,
Yeah,
because they were so much more fit than almost anybody I've encountered. So so yeah, we can learn a lot. And then the other thing that they do, and this is the sleep part, is that there's no electricity. The only
right,
light after dark is firelight. So really, almost as soon as it gets dark and people cook their evening meal, they go to bed. And then
right.
they get up at first light. And in the tropics, that's pretty much 12 hours. So they're probably sleeping 11 hours a night. Now, those people didn't live a long time because there are all kinds of diseases that you get. There's malaria, there's tuberculosis, there are all kinds of parasites. But I have to tell you that when I looked at them, I didn't see a lot of the same diseases. You don't see osteoporosis there. I never saw
Mm.
anybody bent over with
Mm.
osteoporosis.
Mm.
I never saw anybody who was too frail to walk a long
Mm.
ways at a good pace, unless it was from an injury. It's a difficult life, and a lot of people have sustained injuries of some sort during their lives, and for them, it's a little bit different. And then the rest of the villagers take care of them.
Excellent. So you look very fit. I've got a rough idea how old you are, but people always want to know from people that have an interest in aging research. What do you do to keep yourself young? You obviously keep your brain very active. Of course, that's excellent. I presume you don't smoke or drink, but what else do you recommend when people say, "Come on, what's your secret? What can I do to live
And-
longer?"
and- Yeah. So, well, first of all, I don't take any supplements. I don't even take a multivitamin. I have nothing against them. It's just that to me, there's no evidence that they have any significant impact on health as long as you're eating a reasonably healthy diet. I do stay mentally and physically active. I keep a healthy body weight. I mean, I go to the gym. I work out 5 or 6 days a week for an hour to 2 hours. The one thing I don't do well is I don't sleep well.
Right.
um, that may be a consequence of being an academic. It seems to me that people that study aging tend to age relatively slowly. Yeah,
Mhm.
I don't know what it is, but I know just dozens and dozens of researchers that in this field that if you looked at them and then tried to guess their age, you'd guess they're much younger than they really are. So maybe there's something about thinking about aging all the time that keeps you young. I don't know.
How old do you expect to live? Do you ever think of that?
I don't, but I can tell you that I want to live as long as I'm healthy
Right.
enough to do the things that I prize in life. The things I prize in life have to do with getting out into nature,
Mhm.
hiking, being, preserving my senses well enough to appreciate the smells and the sights and the sounds of
Mhm.
nature, being around good friends. And I think being around younger people is actually rejuvenating.
Yes, what I recommend is to do things that young people do. They socialize, they're active. That's one thing. Oh, I'm going to just finish on one last thing. What do you think about metformin? Because that's got a lot of interest.
Yeah, I think metformin is a really interesting drug. You know, the observational epidemiology indicates that it helps stave off cancer and dementia and heart disease, but that's all observational. And so we don't really know yet the impact. But the thing that I like about it is that it's very safe. It's been, millions of people have taken it. It's very inexpensive. So if it turns out that it's a good anti-aging drug, it's not everybody can afford it basically.
Right.
It's, less than $1 a day. And so I think we really, really need to do the clinical trial to find out. The other thing that's interesting about metformin is that all of the most compelling evidence for it as an anti-aging drug come from people, not from animals. The animal work, the mouse work with metformin is not at all impressive. The best studies show no impact on longevity. But on the other hand, in humans, we have a lot of different data. And my thought is, I believe the human data. If human data exists, I place a lot more stock in it than experimental data with mice or rats or fruit flies or anything. So um, I wouldn't say I'm optimistic about a clinical trial of metformin because most clinical trials fail.
Mhm.
But if it turns out that it does have anti-aging properties, then that's huge news. That is huge news, and it could change things almost overnight for people.
Well, thank you very much. That was excellent. I must say that your book is very unique and gives us a lot of insights into longevity. And I would recommend that anyone who has an interest in longevity read this book. Thank you very much.